The emergency operator answered the call at exactly 8:17 p.m. A woman was screaming so loudly that her words were almost impossible to understand. "My husband, please, he's bleeding. He fell. Please hurry." The dispatcher tried to calm her down. "Ma'am, tell me exactly what happened." Between sobs, she repeated the same sentence. "He slipped. He fell onto the knife." It sounded like a tragic household accident. A husband, a kitchen, one unfortunate fall. But when paramedics arrived less than 7 minutes later, something immediately felt wrong. The victim lay motionless on the kitchen floor. Blood stretched across the polished hardwood like a dark river. A large kitchen knife rested nearly 2 meters away from his body. One experienced paramedic paused before even touching the victim. He had responded to hundreds of emergencies over 2 decades. Car crashes, industrial accidents, domestic violence. This scene didn't resemble any accidental fall he had ever witnessed. The wound was deep, far too precise, far too forceful. Yet standing nearby was his wife of 27 years, crying uncontrollably. Her clothes were stained with blood. Her hands trembled. She kept repeating the same sentence. "It was an accident. It was an accident. It was an accident." Neighbors watched from behind their curtains as police vehicles filled the quiet suburban street. Everyone knew the couple. For nearly 3 decades, they had been the family everyone admired. The husband volunteered at community events. The wife never missed a neighborhood fundraiser. They celebrated anniversaries together, hosted summer barbecues, never argued in public. To everyone around them, they had the perfect marriage. But detectives have learned one painful lesson over the years. Sometimes, the happiest houses hide the darkest secrets. As crime scene investigators photographed every inch of the kitchen, one detective noticed something that instantly changed the entire investigation. The blood pattern didn't match the wife's story. If the victim had simply fallen, the blood shouldn't have landed where it did. Someone wasn't telling the truth. And before sunrise, investigators would uncover the first crack in a marriage that had survived nearly 3 decades. A crack that would eventually expose a lie far bigger than anyone imagined. Because this wasn't just the story of a husband who died. It was the story of what can happen when years of silence, resentment, and hidden secrets finally reach their breaking point. And the evidence would soon begin speaking louder than anyone inside that house ever could. By the time the crime scene tape surrounded the property, the quiet neighborhood had become a maze of flashing blue lights. Reporters hadn't arrived yet, but whispers had already begun. No one could believe what had happened inside the white 2-story home on Maple Grove Drive. For 27 years, David and Laura Mitchell had been the couple everyone pointed to as proof that lasting love still existed. They had married in their 20s, raised 2 children, built a comfortable life, never missed anniversaries, never publicly argued. Every Christmas, neighbors admired the lights decorating their house. Every summer, friends gathered around their backyard barbecue. To everyone looking from the outside, their marriage looked almost perfect. But detectives rarely trusted appearances. The happiest family photographs sometimes hide the deepest pain. As forensic investigators continued documenting the kitchen, Detective Sarah Collins walked slowly through the house. Nothing appeared broken. No signs of forced entry. No overturned furniture. No shattered windows. It didn't look like a violent struggle. Yet one man was dead, and the explanation simply didn't fit. Laura sat wrapped in a gray blanket on the back porch. She stared at the ground as another detective switched on a recorder. "Laura, we're going to ask you to tell us everything again." She nodded silently. "My husband was making dinner. I came into the kitchen. He slipped. He fell forward. There was a knife. It all happened so fast." She buried her face in her shaking hands. "I tried to save him." Detective Collins didn't interrupt. She simply listened. Experienced investigators know that people often reveal the truth or expose a lie, not by what they say, but by what they repeat. Laura had mentioned the fall 5 times. She had described the knife 4 times. Yet she had never once asked how her husband was doing. She already knew. Meanwhile, crime scene analyst Marcus Reed examined the bloodstains covering the kitchen floor. Years of experience had taught him that blood tells stories people cannot. Drops, pools, smears, direction, velocity. Every pattern carried meaning. He crouched beside the body outline. Something immediately bothered him. If David had truly fallen forward while holding the knife, the blood should have spread toward the kitchen island. Instead, most of it traveled in the opposite direction. He measured the angle again. Then a third time. The results stayed exactly the same. Quietly, he looked toward Detective Collins. This isn't matching her version. Collins walked over. What are you seeing? Marcus pointed towards several tiny droplets leading away from the body. These aren't passive drops. They're movement stains. She looked closer. You think he was still moving? Marcus nodded. Either moving, or someone moved after he was injured. That single observation transformed the investigation. If David had walked after being stabbed, then Laura's story was incomplete. If someone else moved, then someone had altered the scene. Neither possibility supported an accidental fall. Outside, another detective began speaking with neighbors. Nearly every interview sounded identical. They never fought. They were always smiling. They seemed happy. They were inseparable. But then an elderly neighbor hesitated. There was one thing. The detective looked up. What do you mean? She folded her arms. It wasn't often, but during the last few months, I heard shouting. Late at night. Not every week, but enough that I noticed. What were they arguing about? The woman slowly shook her head. I couldn't hear the words. She paused. But I remember hearing David yell one sentence. The detective leaned forward. What did he say? She looked toward the Mitchell house. He shouted, I can't keep living like this. Silence followed. For investigators, those 6 words carried enormous weight. A marriage that everyone described as perfect was suddenly showing cracks. Back inside the kitchen, the forensic photographer called Detective Collins over once again. There's something else. She approached. What is it? He pointed toward the knife lying several feet from where David had collapsed. It doesn't make sense. Collins frowned. What doesn't? The knife is almost spotless. She looked confused. The victim lost a massive amount of blood. So why? Is there almost none on the handle? The room fell silent. Because if David had accidentally fallen while holding the knife, his blood should have covered every part of it. Instead, the handle appeared strangely clean, as if someone had wiped it. By sunrise, the Mitchell home had become the center of an investigation that no one in the neighborhood could have imagined. Inside the state forensic laboratory, technicians worked through the night. Every photograph, every fingerprint, every blood sample, every fiber was carefully cataloged. Unlike witnesses, physical evidence couldn't be influenced by fear, grief, or guilt. It simply told the truth. And that truth was about to challenge everything Laura Mitchell had said. Detective Sarah Collins arrived at the medical examiner's office just after 8 a.m. Dr. Michael Reeves had already completed the preliminary examination. Without saying a word, he handed her a folder. She opened it. The first line immediately caught her attention. Single penetrating stab wound to the chest. That alone wasn't surprising. The next sentence was, depth of wound indicates significant force. Collins looked up. Could someone receive this injury by accidentally falling? The medical examiner didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to an anatomical chart. He pointed to the victim's chest. The blade entered between 2 ribs. It narrowly missed one lung. It pierced the heart. He paused. The angle is unusually direct. Collins remained silent. Dr. Reeves continued. In my professional opinion, this injury is highly inconsistent with a simple fall. To create this level of penetration, the knife would have required considerable forward force. She asked the question everyone wanted answered. So you're saying someone likely drove the knife into him? The doctor folded his arms. I'm saying the medical evidence doesn't support the accident described by the wife. For the first time since the investigation began, the accident theory was beginning to collapse. Meanwhile, another team examined David's clothing. His shirt revealed something unusual. There was only one cut through the fabric. No tears. No additional punctures. No signs that the knife had shifted during a fall. If someone trips while holding a knife, the blade often changes direction as the body twists. That movement usually leaves irregular damage. David's shirt showed none. The blade had entered cleanly. Almost perfectly. Almost. As though someone had deliberately aimed it. Across town, detectives obtained a warrant for the couple's financial records. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. Mortgage payments, utility bills, insurance premiums, grocery expenses, 27 years of routine family life. Then Detective Collins noticed several large withdrawals. Not hundreds, thousands. Over the previous 8 months. She frowned. Where did this money go? Financial crimes investigator Daniel Ortiz began tracing the transactions. Within an hour, he had an answer. Most of the withdrawals had been made in cash. The rest had been transferred into an account that David controlled alone. Laura's name wasn't attached to it. That raised another question. What was David hiding from his wife? Or, what was he trying to protect? Detectives returned to interview the Mitchells' adult daughter, Emily. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were swollen from crying. I still can't believe Dad is gone. Collins nodded gently. I know this is difficult, but we need to understand what life was like at home. Emily hesitated. For most of my childhood, they were happy, but things changed. When? She stared at the floor. About a year ago. What changed? My dad became quieter. He stopped laughing. He spent more time alone. He looked. She struggled to find the word. Afraid. Collins looked up. Afraid of what? Emily slowly shook her head. I don't know. But one night, I heard them arguing. What were they saying? Emily closed her eyes, replaying the memory. My dad kept saying, you can't keep threatening me forever. The room fell silent. Threatening him? That wasn't the language of an ordinary marital disagreement. Collins wrote the words carefully into her notebook. Every investigation reaches a point where scattered pieces begin forming a picture. Not the full picture, just enough to reveal its outline. And the outline emerging here was deeply troubling. Late that afternoon, forensic analyst Marcus Reed entered the evidence room, carrying the kitchen knife. He wore fresh gloves. This time, he wasn't looking for blood. He was looking for fingerprints. The results arrived less than an hour later. Marcus stared at the report. Then he read it again. It made no sense. He immediately called Detective Collins. You need to come down here. She arrived minutes later. What is it? Marcus placed the fingerprint report on the table. The victim's fingerprints are on the blade. She nodded. That's expected. He looked directly at her. But there are no usable fingerprints on the handle. Collins frowned. None. None. Not David's. Not Laura's. Nothing. She looked back at the knife sealed inside its evidence bag. A kitchen knife used moments before a fatal incident. Should have contained fingerprints. At least one. Instead, the handle had been almost completely wiped clean. Someone hadn't just lied about what happened. Someone had tried to erase the truth. And investigators were about to discover that the biggest deception wasn't inside the kitchen. It had begun months before David Mitchell took his final breath. Every homicide investigation reaches a moment when detectives stop asking what happened and begin asking why someone lied. By the fourth day of the investigation, Detective Sarah Collins no longer believed David Mitchell's death had been a tragic accident. The forensic evidence had already weakened Laura's account. Now it was time to examine something equally important. The timeline. Because if Laura had lied about when certain events happened, everything else she had said could also be false. Investigators obtained search warrants for both David's and Laura's mobile phones. While crime scene analysts extracted deleted messages, another team mapped every phone call, text message, and GPS location from the week leading up to David's death. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Phone calls with family, work emails, grocery reminders, doctor's appointments. The ordinary routine of a couple approaching their 30th wedding anniversary, but buried among hundreds of records. One phone number kept appearing. It wasn't saved under a name. It appeared dozens of times over the previous 3 months, mostly late at night, sometimes after midnight. Several conversations lasted more than an hour. Detective Collins asked the digital analyst, "Did David own this number?" The analyst shook his head. "No, it belongs to Laura." Collins frowned. So who was she speaking to? We're still identifying the subscriber. Hours later, the answer arrived. The number belonged to Mark Ellison, a 53-year-old financial consultant who had worked with Laura nearly 15 years earlier. There was no obvious reason they should still be speaking, especially not in secret, and certainly not several times a week. While detectives investigated the phone records, another team reviewed surveillance footage collected from nearby businesses. The Mitchell home sat on a quiet residential street. There were no cameras facing the front door, but investigators found security footage from a gas station less than 2 miles away. Laura had told detectives she spent the entire afternoon at home before David died. The timestamp on the video told a different story. At 4:43 p.m., Laura's SUV pulled into the station. She bought bottled water, a newspaper, and something else. The cashier remembered her immediately. She looked nervous. What did she buy? The cashier handed investigators a copy of the receipt. Detective Collins read it carefully. Water, newspaper, cleaning wipes, latex gloves. She looked at the cashier. Did she mention why she needed gloves? He thought for a moment. No. But I remember she asked where the restroom was. She stayed inside for several minutes. Longer than most customers. Nothing about buying gloves was illegal. Nothing about cleaning wipes proved murder. But together, the purchases caught investigators' attention, especially because Laura had never mentioned leaving the house. Later that afternoon, detectives interviewed David's younger brother, Andrew. Unlike the neighbors, Andrew didn't describe the marriage as perfect. He sighed heavily before speaking. They loved each other once. But something changed. What do you mean? Andrew leaned forward. My brother called me 2 weeks before he died. What did he say? He told me. He was thinking about filing for divorce. Detective Collins looked up immediately. Did he explain why? Andrew nodded slowly. He said he couldn't trust Laura anymore. He believed she was hiding something. What? He didn't tell me. He just kept saying, if the truth comes out, everything changes. Those words echoed through the interview room. Everything changes. What truth? Financial problems? An affair? Something even darker? Investigators still didn't know. But for the first time, they had evidence that David had been planning a future without Laura. That evening, laboratory results from the crime scene arrived. Marcus Reed reviewed them one page at a time. Blood samples, DNA profiles, trace evidence. Then, he stopped. One result didn't belong. He immediately walked into Detective Collins' office. You need to see this. She looked up from her desk. What did you find? Marcus placed a photograph beside the lab report. It showed a small blood smear near the kitchen doorway. We tested this sample separately. It isn't David's. Collins stared at him. It isn't Laura's either. She sat upright. What are you saying? Marcus took a slow breath. There was another person's blood inside that kitchen. Silence filled the room. Until now, detectives believed only 2 people had been inside the house when David died. Now forensic evidence suggested a shocking possibility. Someone else had been there. Someone neither David nor Laura had ever mentioned. Collins looked back at the photograph. One tiny stain, barely visible to the naked eye, yet it had the potential to change the entire case. Because if a third person had entered that kitchen, then investigators weren't just searching for a motive anymore. They were searching for someone who had vanished without leaving a trace. 5 days after David Mitchell's death, the investigation had reached a turning point. The evidence was no longer pointing in one direction. It was pointing in several. A wiped knife handle. A timeline that didn't match. Secret late-night phone calls. A marriage on the verge of collapse. And now, DNA from an unidentified person inside the kitchen. Detective Sarah Collins knew it was time to confront Laura again. This interview would be different. The detectives weren't looking for a confession. They were looking for the moment her story broke. Laura entered the interview room wearing the same wedding ring she had worn for 27 years. Her eyes were swollen. Her voice was softer than before. She looked exhausted. But Detective Collins had learned something during her years investigating homicide. People can become tired. They can become emotional. But the truth rarely changes. Lies almost always do. The recorder clicked on. Collins spoke calmly. Laura, thank you for coming back. Laura nodded. I've already told you everything. We're just trying to understand exactly what happened. Laura folded her hands together. It was an accident. Collins let the silence linger. Then she slid a photograph across the table. It was the kitchen, taken minutes after David died. Laura glanced at it only briefly. I've already seen those. Collins nodded. I know, but I'd like you to explain something. She pointed toward the knife. You told us David fell while holding this. Yes. You also told us you never touched it. That's right. Collins opened another folder. The fingerprints disagree. Laura looked confused. There weren't any fingerprints. Exactly. Laura blinked. What does that mean? It means someone cleaned the handle. The room became silent. For several seconds, Laura said nothing. Then she quietly replied, I don't know how that happened. Detective Collins changed the subject. Were you home all afternoon? Yes. You never left? No. Collins reached into another folder. This time she placed a receipt on the table. Gas station. 4:43 p.m. Cleaning wipes. Latex gloves. Bottled water. Laura stared at it. Her breathing became noticeably slower. You told us you stayed home. She hesitated. I forgot. You forgot leaving your house. It wasn't important. It is now. Laura rubbed her forehead. I only went to buy water. And the gloves. I was cleaning. The wipes. I always buy cleaning supplies. Collins didn't argue. She simply wrote something in her notebook. Because every answer Laura gave created another contradiction. Across the hall, Detective James Porter watched through the observation window. He whispered to another investigator. She's adapting. What do you mean? She's no longer repeating the original story. Now she's explaining the evidence. Experienced interrogators recognize this shift immediately. When innocent people remember events, their story usually stays consistent. When guilty people encounter unexpected evidence, their story often evolves to fit it. Meanwhile, forensic analyst Marcus Reed received another laboratory report. This one concerned the unidentified blood sample found near the kitchen doorway. He opened the envelope. Read the first line, then immediately called Detective Collins. You need to hear this. She stepped into the hallway. What happened? Marcus spoke carefully. The unknown blood doesn't belong to a stranger. Collins frowned. Then who? It belongs to Laura. She stared at him. That's impossible. We already had Laura's DNA. I know. Marcus continued. The sample near the doorway came from Laura. But it wasn't deposited the same day David died. Collins looked puzzled. What are you saying? The blood had dried. It was older. Several days older. Silence. If Laura's blood had already been inside the kitchen before David was killed, then investigators had been asking the wrong question. The blood wasn't evidence of another suspect. It was evidence of another incident. Something violent had happened inside that kitchen, days before David died, and no one had ever reported it. Detectives immediately requested enhanced forensic testing. Using chemical enhancement, investigators searched the entire kitchen for older blood traces invisible to the naked eye. When the lights were switched off, the room transformed. Blue forensic light illuminated dozens of hidden stains. Tiny droplets, small smears, patterns beneath freshly cleaned flooring. Someone had scrubbed the kitchen. Not once. Repeatedly. Over several weeks. Detective Collins slowly looked around the room. This wasn't the first violent incident in this house. The forensic team continued photographing every glowing stain. Near the sink, along the cabinet doors, even beneath the refrigerator. Someone had worked extremely hard to erase them. But no cleaning product could erase every trace. Science had found what human eyes never could. Later that evening, detectives executed a search warrant on David's home office. Most of the room looked ordinary. Business files, family photographs, awards, tax documents. Nothing unusual. Until Officer Hernandez noticed a locked metal box hidden behind a shelf. Inside were several envelopes, a handwritten journal, and a sealed letter. Across the front, David had written just 6 words. Open only if something happens to me. The room fell completely silent. Detective Collins carefully unfolded the letter. As she began reading the first paragraph, her expression changed instantly. Because David hadn't been afraid of an accident. He had been afraid of someone. And the name written in the first sentence was one detectives never expected to see. The evidence box sat untouched for nearly a minute. No one in the room spoke. Detective Sarah Collins carefully unfolded the handwritten letter, taking care not to damage the paper. Across the top, David had written the date. It was exactly 6 weeks before his death. The first sentence stopped everyone cold. If you're reading this, something has happened to me, and I don't believe it was an accident. Collins looked up at the detectives surrounding her. The room fell silent. David hadn't written the letter in anger. He hadn't written it after an argument. He had written it because he believed he was in danger. She continued reading. I've spent months pretending everything is fine because I hoped things would get better. Instead, they've become worse. I'm afraid of the woman I've shared my life with for 27 years. One detective slowly removed his glasses. Another quietly closed the office door. No one interrupted. Every word mattered. The next pages described a marriage that was completely different from the one neighbors thought they knew. David admitted they had once been deeply in love. He wrote about raising their children, building a home, starting businesses together, celebrating birthdays and anniversaries. But then, his words changed. Somewhere along the way, love became control. He described constant arguments over money, growing secrecy, threats made during late-night confrontations. He claimed Laura had repeatedly warned him that leaving the marriage would destroy everything. According to David, the arguments had become more frequent over the previous year. He had begun sleeping in the guest bedroom. He had quietly contacted a divorce attorney, and he had started documenting everything. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he feared no one would believe him. Inside the same metal box, investigators found something else. A small digital voice recorder. Forensic technicians immediately copied its contents. Most of the recordings were ordinary. Business meetings, personal reminders, shopping lists. Then they discovered one file recorded just 11 days before David's death. The audio quality wasn't perfect. Voices echoed through what sounded like the kitchen. David's voice remained calm. "I don't want to fight." Laura answered almost immediately. "If you leave me, you'll regret it." A long silence followed. Then David spoke again. "Are you threatening me?" Laura's reply was barely above a whisper. "You'll find out." The recording ended. No sounds of violence. No confession. But investigators now possessed independent evidence that directly contradicted Laura's claim that their marriage had been peaceful. The investigation accelerated. Detectives subpoenaed financial records dating back 5 years. This time, forensic accountants uncovered something significant. Several life insurance policies had recently been updated. One, in particular, caught Detective Collins' attention. David's policy had been increased dramatically, just 4 months before his death. The sole beneficiary, Laura Mitchell, the payout exceeded $2 million. Insurance alone does not prove motive. Millions of families responsibly maintain life insurance. But when combined with mounting forensic evidence, the discovery raised serious questions, especially after investigators learned that David had recently contacted the insurance company. He had requested paperwork to change the beneficiary. The documents had never been submitted. Police obtained a warrant to search Laura's laptop. Deleted files were recovered. Among them were internet searches made during the weeks before David's death. Investigators stared at the screen. The searches painted a troubling picture. How long do deleted messages stay on a phone? Can bleach remove blood from wood? What happens if someone dies without a will? Life insurance after spouse dies. Standing alone. None of those searches proved murder. Together, they suggested preparation rather than panic. 8 days after David's death, detectives requested one final interview with Laura. This time, the atmosphere was very different. She entered the room without making eye contact. The confidence she displayed during earlier interviews had disappeared. Detective Collins placed 3 items on the table: the handwritten letter, the insurance documents, the transcript of the voice recording. Laura looked at them. Her face became expressionless. Collins spoke quietly. "David believed he was afraid of you." Laura didn't answer. "You told us your marriage was happy." Still nothing. "You told us there had been no serious arguments." Silence. "You told us David accidentally fell." Laura stared at the tabletop. Then, after nearly 30 seconds, she finally spoke. Very softly. "He wasn't supposed to die?" Detective Collins looked up immediately. The room became perfectly still. Those 5 words changed the investigation forever. Because Laura had stopped talking about an accident and started talking about intent. She quickly covered her mouth, as though she realized what she had just said. But it was too late. Every word had been recorded. Investigators now believed they were no longer searching for the truth. They had finally found it. Nearly 14 months after David Mitchell's death, Courtroom 3 was filled long before the trial began. Family members occupied the front rows. Neighbors who had once admired the Mitchells sat quietly behind them. Reporters lined the back of the courtroom, notebooks open, waiting for the proceedings to begin. For the first time since David's death, every piece of evidence would be presented in public, and every lie would be examined under oath. The prosecution began with a simple statement. This case is not about a tragic accident. It is about a deliberate act, followed by a carefully constructed lie. Over the next 2 weeks, jurors watched the investigation unfold exactly as detectives had experienced it. Crime scene photographs, forensic reports, the emergency call, the blood pattern analysis, the clean knife handle, the hidden letter, the audio recording. Each piece of evidence, by itself, raised questions. Together, they formed a compelling narrative. The lead crime scene analyst took the witness stand. Using enlarged photographs, he explained why David's injury was inconsistent with an accidental fall. He described the bloodstain patterns, the movement inside the kitchen, the wiped knife handle, the chemical testing that revealed older bloodstains beneath the clean floor. The prosecutor asked. In your expert opinion, did the physical evidence support Mrs. Mitchell's explanation? The analyst answered without hesitation. No, it did not. The courtroom remained silent. Next came the medical examiner. He calmly explained the fatal wound. Its angle, its depth, the force required to inflict it. Again, the prosecutor asked, could this injury reasonably occur from someone simply falling onto a kitchen knife? The doctor looked toward the jury. In my professional opinion, it is highly unlikely. Perhaps the most emotional testimony came from Emily Mitchell. She fought back tears as she described the parents she once believed had the perfect marriage. I love them both. She paused. I never imagined our family would end like this. The courtroom listened in complete silence. She recalled hearing arguments late at night, remembering how her father had slowly become withdrawn, how he seemed afraid, and how she wished she had understood the warning signs sooner. Not a single juror looked away. The defense argued something very different. Laura's attorneys insisted the marriage had become strained, but denied there had been any plan to kill David. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial. They argued investigators had built a theory instead of finding direct proof. They reminded the jury that no eyewitness had seen what happened inside the kitchen. And legally, that mattered. The burden of proof rested entirely with the prosecution. Then came the moment no one in the courtroom would forget. The prosecution played David's voice recording. His calm voice echoed through the courtroom. I don't want to fight. Then Laura's response. If you leave me, you'll regret it. The courtroom became eerily quiet. Several jurors exchanged brief glances. David's sister lowered her head. Even the judge allowed a long pause before the trial continued. Finally, the jury heard a recording made during Laura's last police interview. Detective Collins asked, You told us this was an accident. Then Laura's quiet voice filled the courtroom. He wasn't supposed to die? Those 5 words echoed across the room. The prosecution argued they revealed consciousness of guilt. The defense insisted they reflected panic and grief. The meaning would now belong to the jury. After nearly 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. No one moved. Laura stared straight ahead. David's children held each other's hands. The clerk stood. Members of the jury, have you reached a unanimous verdict? We have. The foreperson handed the written decision to the judge. The judge unfolded the paper, then looked directly at Laura Mitchell. On the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. A quiet gasp spread through the courtroom. David's daughter began to cry. His brother closed his eyes. Laura remained completely still, without expression, without speaking, without looking back at her family as deputies placed handcuffs on her wrists. 27 years of marriage had ended not with love, but with a conviction for murder. Closing reflection. Cases like this remind us that appearances can be deeply misleading. To neighbors, David and Laura Mitchell seemed to have built a life many people admired. A lasting marriage, a beautiful home, a close-knit family. But behind closed doors, unresolved conflict, fear, and deception had quietly taken root. No photograph, no anniversary celebration, no smiling family portrait can reveal what truly happens inside a relationship. In the end, it wasn't rumor that uncovered the truth. It wasn't gossip. It wasn't speculation. It was careful police work, forensic science, and the evidence that refused to disappear. David Mitchell never had the opportunity to tell investigators what happened that night, but through the traces left behind, his story was heard, and justice, however delayed, finally caught up with the lie. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy well-researched, documentary-style true crime stories that focus on evidence, investigation, and the pursuit of justice, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden in abandoned buildings or dark alleyways. Sometimes, they're hidden behind the front door of a house everyone believes is filled with love.